Hello, everyone, and welcome to American Civil War and UK History channel on YouTube. Remember, on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And I'm also part of the Unfiltered Historian team. And most of our videos are available as podcasts from wherever you get your podcasts from. So joining me today is historian, professor of early modern history of York University, and also an author of a book called Remember, a cultural history of Guy Fawkes' day. It's Professor James Sharpe. Hello, thanks for joining me.
That's okay, yeah.
So we are here to discuss one of Britain's most important events in history, the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, which is now commemorated with fireworks, bonfire night on the 5th of November every year. And the saying goes, remember, the 5th of November. Now, before we get into the plot itself, let's look at the origins of religious tensions in England and how it all starts, because it's not as simple as just the plot. There's a long build up to this. So would I be right in saying, sorry, that it starts during King Henry VIII's reign?
Yeah, I think obviously the background to it is the English Reformation. And one point which I would make, which is difficult for a lot of people to grasp these days, is just how important religion was in this period in all sorts of dimensions. I think you can trace it back. You trace the English Reformation back, obviously, to Henry VIII's reign. Henry's marital problems, the inability of Catherine of Aragon to produce an heir, brought about a break with Rome. Henry himself was doctrinally conservative. So I think what he was wanting was for him to be head of the church in England, but to not go too far down the Protestant line, because obviously in continental Europe at this period, the Protestant Reformation with Luther was really kicking off. Henry attempted to contain Protestantism, but he died in 1547, and he was followed by a very brief reign by his son, Edward VI, which led to a swing towards a more continental form of Protestantism. Protestantism, had Edward lived, I think would have been very firmly established in England earlier than it was. But he died young. I think it was about 11 when he died. In 1553, his elder stepsister, Mary, came to the throne. And Mary was a convinced Catholic. She saw herself as representing the Catholic cause in England. And she married Philip II of Spain, who was heading up the Catholic superpower of the period. So she attempts to move England back towards Catholicism, and results in about 300 burnings of Protestants as heretics, and leads to a lot of other people going into exile in her reign. But again, she too dies very soon after coming to the throne in 1558. And at that stage, Henry's second daughter, Elizabeth, takes over, Elizabeth I, and her sort of personal views on religion are a little bit opaque. She, like a lot of things about Elizabeth, it's difficult to work out what's really going on in her mind. But she is the daughter of Anne Boleyn, who is seen as executed in 1536, seen as somebody who is pushing the Protestant cause forward under Henry. And the advisors gathered around her are largely Protestant. For example, her favourite, the Earl of Leicester, is a sort of protector, patron of Protestant ecclesiastics and thinkers. And the logic of her situation is for the church in England, which she is now the head of course, to be pushed more towards a Protestant position. And there's a lot more going on behind that, which we don't have time to go into. So Elizabeth finds herself fronting up what is essentially a Protestant regime. During Elizabeth's reign, a number of things develop. I'd like to take a quick detour to the continent, because what's going on in England is only comprehensible in terms of Europe being racked by wars of religion. between Catholics and Protestants. So there's increasing polarization, and also, in particular, focusing on the French wars of religion, which kick off in the 1560s. These are incredibly brutal. I mean, people are killing each other for religious reasons, in quite large numbers. And in particular, there's an incident in 1572, which gets remembered as the St. Bartholomew Nights Massacre, in which somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 Protestants are massacred in Paris in one day, and maybe nationally about 10,000 Protestants are massacred in France. The other great conflict is the Dutch Revolt, which is seen as being Protestant Dutchmen and women fighting against Catholic Spain. We're back to this idea of Spain as the Catholic superpower. And although there's no single incident like the St. Bartholomew Night Massacre in the Dutch Revolt, there are a series of massacres of typically Protestant town populations where the town is besieged by the Spanish forces, and when the Spanish forces take the town, they just wipe out the inhabitants or kill a large number of the inhabitants. So what you've got, if you are an English Protestant observer, is a situation where you're looking nervously across the North Sea, you're looking nervously across the Channel, and you're seeing Catholic atrocities which get publicised. In England itself, because of this international situation, Catholics are being seen as increasingly suspect. Catholics are a small minority. I mean, we can't put a figure on it, but I've seen a figure as low as 1% of the population, maybe a bit more than that, but maybe 5%, and also regionally strong in the north in particular. And in 1569, there is actually a rebellion in the north of England, a pro-Catholic rebellion, which is put down brutally. But on the tail of this, the then Pope declares Elizabeth to be illegitimate, to be no true monarch, and says that Elizabeth's subjects are entitled, it is no sin to get rid of her. Now, this means that all English Catholics are potentially traitors. And this is the way they're seen by Protestant propagandists. Now, most of the Catholic minority in England just want to keep their heads down, stay out of trouble, and be allowed to sort of lead as normal a life as they can. But as the reign progresses, and especially against this continental polarization, Catholics are seen as being potentially traitorous, and there are a series of laws passed against them, which involve heavy fines if you don't attend your parish church. If you disseminate Catholic publications or Catholic propaganda, you can be variously done for felony or abetting treason. If you shelter or aid a Catholic priest, it's a capital offence. And of course, from about the middle of the reign, you've got Catholic priests coming, English Catholic priests who are trained abroad coming into England, and they are executed as traitors if they're caught, or could be. So under Elizabeth, around about, I think it's 130 people or thereabouts, are Catholics are executed under Elizabeth. About 2/3 of them priests, the remainder ordinary people who are helping priests.
Okay. Also, I'd like to bring up, I know she's not really part of that story. Well, she is, but she isn't. So Mary Queen of Scots obviously is the mother of James I.
Yeah.
Does this, obviously this Elizabeth not having a child, that's going to affect England, obviously, to come in the next few years. So just explain a little bit about that, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, Elizabeth, as you've just said, I mean, she never marries. She is childless. Even worse, she doesn't actually declare who she wants as her successor, which would have made things a lot easier. Again, we're back to this slightly inscrutable quality to Elizabeth. But there are numerous potential claimants to the English throne, a large proportion of whom are Catholic. Mary Queen of Scots' son, Mary herself, is of course executed in England in 1587. She is seen as a potential leader by English Catholics. Elizabeth's regime knows this. and she's implicated in a Catholic plot and is executed in 1587, which removes that problem for the English Protestant regime. But as you say quite correctly, there is no very obvious heir to Elizabeth, and James is brought in, I think, largely through the machinations of the English Protestant elite, and he's ticks all the right boxes. He's male, he's adult, he's sane, he's Protestant, and he's got 2 sons. So there's going to be no problems. Well, I think there's going to be no problems of succession there. So James is emerging late in Elizabeth's reign as probably, nobody's actually saying it, but probably the next ruler of England. And when Elizabeth dies, she does give some sort of very faint signs that she is okay with James taking over, and he is brought south by England's Protestant regime.
Okay, but I mean, obviously, his mother was obviously Catholic. Would you say James was? So he was 100% Protestant, or was he Catholic? Did he have Catholic tendencies?
Well, James is actually 100% Protestant, but there are 2 things. One is the fact that he is Mary Queen of Scots' son does give English Catholics a bit of false optimism. So they are thinking that they might get a better deal from James than they have from Elizabeth. And of course, although I think this is kept as quiet as possible, his wife converts to Catholicism, Anne of Denmark. James is, he's internationally regarded as a Protestant ruler, but another feature of James is that he is hostile to strife. He's basically a fairly pacific man. So although he is Protestant, he's maybe a bit less likely to go and hunt Catholics than, say, some of Elizabeth's ministers were.
And this is going to be the problem, isn't it? Because they think they are going to get a sweeter deal, or they're going to get, better treatment. And of course, James doesn't, does he? And also, this is where you get the crossover of the 2 kingdoms as well. So England and Scotland become, one through this king being coronated, don't they? Okay, let's move on to the plot then. So the actual plot itself. So you've got the main one of the main guys is a guy called Sir Robert Catesby. So please explain a little bit more about this guy.
Yeah, Catesby is one of the great ironies of the plot that everybody remembers Guy Fawkes. Nobody remembers Catesby, and Catesby is the man who really sets the plot up and gets it going. He is killed in a shootout at Holbeach House, where a number of the plotters, after the plot is discovered, are attempting to raise a large-scale Catholic rebellion in the Midlands. This goes nowhere, and a number of them are caught by the local militia in this place called Holbeach House, and Catesby is shot and fatally wounded there. So one of the great problems for the history of the plot, for historians looking at the plot, is that we don't have Catesby's confession. So we don't know what exactly is going on. But Catesby comes from an established Catholic family. That family, gentry family, so he's relatively upper class. That family is being hammered by the anti-Catholic laws I referred to. His father does time in prison. The family is paying heavy fines. Catesby himself, interestingly, in the way that the mix goes on in this period, marries a Protestant girl. And he appears to be doing what's known as being a church papist, which means that whatever his private beliefs, he is at least attending his parish church, keeping up a pretense. Then in 1598, his wife dies. Apparently he's devoted to his wife. And at that stage, he seems to become radicalized. And that's where he really swings back to Catholicism. And he is taking a fairly militant position. As I've said, most Catholics would pay the fines or just try to stay out of trouble. Catesby is hardening his attitude, and he's very much taking the attitude that we are being, Catholics are being disadvantaged, we're being subjected to penal laws, our priests are being executed if they're caught. We need to do something about this. And we only have Catholic accounts of Catesby, but he does come across, just looking at the history of the plot, looking at the way in which he draws in plotters, he does come across as being a very charismatic man. He's obviously got great powers of persuasion, and he's obviously a very forceful figure. And he is the man who is the dynamo that gets this plot started and keeps it going.
Mm-hmm. And obviously the main person that everyone will know out of this, because obviously the, Guy Fawkes Night, it's named after this guy. So, I mean, tell us a little bit more about Guy Fawkes, or Guido Fawkes, as he's also known as, and just explain a little bit more about him, please.
Yeah, sure. Fawkes is born in York in 1570. Again, one of the things about the plotters is that a lot of them are born, give or take, 1570. So by 1605, they're men in their mid-30s, they're mature. A lot of them have done things in the world. Fawkes himself is the son of a man who is a lawyer in the ecclesiastical courts at York. Now, York was then, or still is actually, but was then a very important ecclesiastical centre. One of England's two archbishops operated from York. It's the centre of the church in the north of England. So York church courts are quite important. So his father is a lawyer, his grandfather was a lawyer. On his mother's side, you've got merchants in York. One of his grandfathers had been Mayor of York, Lord Mayor of York. So you're looking at somebody from a very solid background, like Catesby, but urban rather than rural gentry. And then when he's about 8, his father dies and his mother remarries, and she marries into a North Yorkshire rural Catholic family. Her family background, although she marries a Protestant, again, the way that things are so mixed in this period, her family background is Catholic and she reverts to that. So the young guy is brought up as a Catholic, and he too appears to get radicalized. At the age of 21, when he comes to maturity, legal maturity, he sells his estates in York, his inherited land in just outside York, and he goes and joins the what's known as the Army of Flanders, which is the Spanish army which is fighting the Dutch in the Low Countries. And we're going back to this international situation, the sort of wars of religion that are taking place in Europe at this time. Now, Fawkes, it's called the Spanish Army. In fact, it's an international force, about 60,000 men, about 20,000 are German, 20,000 are French-speaking Walloon Belgians, or what we call Belgians these days. There's a big Italian contingent and Spaniards. There's a body of about 500 English and Scottish gentlemen volunteers, and Fawkes is in this body. He is apparently a very efficient soldier. He's very brave as well. He's also seen as being very conventionally religious. Again, we only have a Catholic account of Fawkes's character, so it's a biased source. He's like Catesby, a fairly charismatic figure. He's tall, he's well built, red hair, red beard, as you can see in the picture there. And he is obviously getting a reputation, not just in the army, but also in the English Catholic emigre community in Europe, for being a sort of dependable sort of guy. He is used on a mission to Spain in 1603. English Catholics are constantly hoping for Spanish support for a rising in England. And two things. The major thing is, of course, that Fawkes is being brought in as the explosive expert. The wars in the Low Country are fought very much through sieges, which involve mining, trying to blow up fortifications and so on. So it's a speculation, but I think it must be a good one, is that Fawkes is recruited because he knows about explosives. Once Catesby has formulated this idea about blowing up Parliament, and he's an expert with explosive. Fawkes is the man. And also, as you said, he appears a lot in contemporary accounts as Guido Fawkes. I think he picks that up while he's in the army in the Low Countries, because Guido is an Italian form. there are a lot of Italians in that army. So I just think he gets called that because he's working in an international context.
Mm-hmm. And how do they? So how do they actually go about recruiting Guy Fawkes then? How do they? So does Catesby know Fawkes
Yeah,
before?
Catesby doesn't know him, but he's known, as I said, he's known in Catholic circles. There is as well as the Catholics serving English Catholics serving with the Spanish army. There are a number of Catholics, some of them quite influential, who are operating in the Low Countries in Spain, who are known to Spanish diplomats, and Fawkes is developing a reputation. And I think feelers are sent out to him, obviously. Catesby would know about him through this network. And there are all sorts of networks, both in England and internationally, involving Catholics. So Fawkes is recruited, I think, because of, he's got military experience and also he's known to be reliable.
So English Catholics are constantly keeping one eye on what's going on in Europe then?
Well, certainly, yes. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So other conspirators include, we have John and Christopher Wright, Robert and Thomas Wintour, Thomas Percy, Robert Keyes, Thomas Bates, John Grant, Ambrose Rockwood, Sir Everard Digby, and Francis Tersham. So the plot itself, please explain why and how it unfolds and how we actually get to the 5th November 1605.
Yeah, well, you mentioned the names of the plotters there. They come in sequentially, if you like. I mean, the Wintour brothers are actually cousins of Catesby. So a lot of these people are, not a lot, but a number of them. Tresham is also a cousin of Catesby's. So again, we're back to knowing people who are reliable or thought to be reliable. The Wintour brothers, gentry like Catesby, again, certainly Thomas Wintour is a fairly charismatic figure. He's got military experience. He's a swordsman, as they say at the time. And he is the main source for the plot, really. He goes back, he's one of the first people that Catesby contacts. And his confession is one of the main sources we've got for what's going on in the early stages. Because at first, Catesby recruits a very small group who meet famously in the Duck and Drake pub, I think it's called, in the Strand in London in the summer of 1604. And these are the people who are at the centre of it. Then others, for example, Bates, who you mentioned, is a servant of Catesby's. He hears about the plot by accident, just hears his master talking about it. So he's brought in. Rookwood, Digby, and some of the others are brought in at a very late stage. Tresham's brought in at a late stage because they are people with a base in the Midlands where they're planning to get this rising taking off, and a couple of them actually own quite a large number of horses, so they're hoping to get cavalry together on that basis. So the plot forms gradually, and one of the most remarkable things about it is that it stays very, very secure. It's watertight. There are, for example, an awful lot of plots under Elizabeth, which are permeated by government agents or, they don't prove watertight. There are a couple of plots early in James's reign with Catholic involvement, right at the beginning of James's reign, which might have hardened his attitudes towards Catholics. They get blown quite easily. The Gunpowder plotters stay fairly solid until a fairly late stage. Now, going back to the international dimension, as I mentioned, English Catholics are hopeful of support from Spain in an armed rising. And of course, if we're going back to why English Catholics are scared of Spain, you have the Armada in 1588, which again shows what Catholics would like to do. So in the last third of Elizabeth's reign and the very beginning of James's reign, England is at war with Spain. Then what James does in 1604 is end that war. Now that, I think, again, is something which hardens Catesby's and the plotters' attitude, that they can't depend on help from Spain anymore. So they really are thrown back on their own resources. So this is the stage at which I think they really do decide that if anything's got to be done, it's them that's got to do it. And another interesting consequence of the end of that war is that there was a lot of gunpowder on the market. It's like military surplus stuff after World War II. Buying large quantities of gunpowder if you're a private person is illegal, but I think there's so much about that the plotters are able to acquire a large amount fairly secretly.
Mhm. And it must have been quite dangerous bringing those people in late, but like you said, it was watertight, so they
Yeah.
would have vetted them beforehand, I take it. Can I just ask about their plan to use Elizabeth, James's daughter Elizabeth?
Yeah, sure. This is where it all gets a bit opaque because oddly, I mean, as far as we can tell, and there might be stuff that was never documented that we just don't know about, but as far as we can tell, they hadn't done a lot of planning about what was going to happen after Parliament was blown up. The idea seems to have been to go into the Midlands, where Catesby comes from, where the Winters come from, where the Wright brothers come from, and depend on a more or less spontaneous rising by Catholics in that area. And the idea was to set up a Catholic regime with Elizabeth fronting it. Now, Elizabeth is about 9 years old, 10 years old at the time. And she is sort of held, well, held is too strong a word, but she's being looked after, educated in a country house near to Coventry. So again, it's Midlands. And as far as we can tell, the idea was to set up a regime fronted up by senior Catholics. It's very unclear who they were going to be. And with Elizabeth as a sort of puppet princess, giving the regime some degree of legitimacy.
Okay. So the night in question, the 5th of November, how does the plot unfold?
Well, the crucial point here is what's known as the Mount Eagle letter. And again, this is one of the great mysteries. A lot of ink has been spilt on who actually wrote this letter, but the basic story is that Lord Mount Eagle, who was a member of the House of Lords, so would have been sitting in Parliament when the explosion was scheduled, on the 26th of October, received a letter. This was just dropped off on his doorway to one of his servants by a man whose identity has never been established. And the letter warns Mount Eagle to stay away from Parliament when Parliament opens. It's due to open on the 5th of November, of course, because something nasty, which is unspecified, is going to happen. Now, we just do not know who wrote that letter. For example, Antonio Fraser has suggested that Mount Eagle, who had, now Mount Eagle was a relapsed Catholic. He'd given assurances that he was going to observe Church of England services under James's reign, but he had a Catholic wife and he was involved in Catholic networks. So he was obviously somebody who might have heard if anything was going on. And what he does, it's been suggested by Antonio Fraser, for example, that he might have actually written the letter himself, or had it written, obviously, by a servant, once he'd heard about the plot. But in any case, whoever wrote it, his reaction is to try to distance himself from the plot. He just knows that if this letter is found out, if it's heard about, if the plot takes place, he's got no idea what's going to happen. He knows something nasty is going to happen, that he would be implicated. So he just reports it straight away to the Earl of Salisbury, who is in effect James's Prime Minister. The Earl of Salisbury reports it to other Privy Councillors. James I is away hunting, but he hears about this letter on the 1st of November. So the government knows that something odd could be happening or could be planned. The plotters hear about this, but Catesby, who's quite bullish about it, says, well, it's too unspecific for anything to be landed on us, so we're going to be okay. And they decide to go ahead. Now, with this letter, as I've suggested, the government gets to hear about the possibility of something being planned for when Parliament opens. So on the night of the 4th, they decide to carry out a search on the Palace of Westminster, which is where Parliament is going to meet. Now, another thing which is very surprising to the modern observer is that there was practically no security on the Palace of Westminster. The plotters had rented through Henry Percy, had rented what's normally described as a cellar. It's some sort of storeroom. It's an undercroft in the Palace of Westminster. And that's where they've hidden the gunpowder, 36 barrels of it. So they managed to get 36 barrels of gunpowder in. It was hidden under a load of firewood. So yeah, Palace of Westminster, you've got private apartments, you've got wine merchants, you've got ale houses, you've got no security. So they're able to rent this place and move the gunpowder in there. And the Earl of Suffolk is delegated to lead a search party in the closing hours of the 4th of November. He doesn't actually do anything very positive, but he reports back that there is this cellar or whatever with a suspiciously large amount of firewood in it, and a servant called John Johnson, who is Guy Fawkes under an assumed identity, who unusually for it being that late at night is wearing a cloak, wearing a hat, and has spurs. So he's obviously possibly going to be riding somewhere in the near future. So a second search party is sent out under a rather more purposeful character called Sir Thomas Knivet. And it says that search party which apprehends Fawkes, which pulls away the firewood, and which discovers the gunpowder. Fawkes attempts to resist. He is overpowered, of course. There are too many of them. They've got troops with them, small party of troops, and he's taken off and interrogated. And that's when the plot really cracks. So it's either late on the 4th of November or early on the 5th of November, in the early hours of the 5th of November, 1605, that Fawkes is apprehended and the plot is effectively over.
Mm-hmm. So again, because the king already knew about the suspected plot, they stayed away from Parliament anyway, I take it.
Yeah, Parliament was immediately prorogued, yeah. And yeah, Fawkes, as I said, was taken off and interrogated. They managed to get some information about the plotters at that early stage. So people are leaving London. Fawkes himself holds out, but certainly better than I would under torture. But he eventually confesses, and obviously other people are implicated when he does that.
So again, he's taken to the Tower of London, and you can imagine what the poor guy went through.
Yeah.
This is I have a picture here of what is said to be his signature of his confession. And from what I understand myself is that he was obviously they used thumb screws on him or something along them lines, which is why his signature is the way it is. Is that something that's true?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit uncertain exactly what was done to him. You know, he was tortured. They may have used thumb screws. They might also have used something called the manacles. Now, what these were basically iron gloves, if you like, into which the hand was placed and locked into, and suspended by chains from the ceiling. So you were hung up by your arms, and you had a sort of block kicked them up from underneath you and just left hanging there. So that would, of course, not do your handwriting any good.
And again, it's not gonna be long before you confess, is it? Let's be honest.
Yeah. But he did hold out for quite a long time.
Yeah, so I suppose he's where he's been in the fighting in the wars. I suppose he's quite a hard guy, isn't he? I suppose. Yeah. So I want to talk about Sir John Potterm, Lord Justice. So apparently he investigates the plot. Is that right?
Yeah. He carries out investigations. Yeah.
Yeah. So he finds out. How do they find out that it's Robert Catesby that is involved in the plot?
I think this would be Fawkes's confession.
Mm-hmm.
but certainly Catesby has already got out of town. And as I said, there are, I'm not quite sure what the mechanism is, but certainly they have ideas about the identity of one or two of the plotters.
And there's a last stand at Holbeach House,
Yeah.
which I know you did say a little bit about. But there is also an incident that happens where there's an accidental explosion of gunpowder.
Yeah. Yeah, this is again to the modern eye, this seems very peculiar. What happens is on the 4th of November, in anticipation of the explosion occurring, things going correctly, Catesby and one or two of the other plotters go down to the Midlands, where they call together Catholics they know, Catholic gentry, and under the pretense of a hunting party. So they get together, meet up in an inn, they have dinner in an inn, and they then let the people that have drawn together know what's really happening. And obviously, most of them just go. They go home. They don't want any involvement. There is a guy called. God, I forgot his name. Yeah, there's a man called Stephen Littleton who decides to stay with the plot, and he leads the plotters back to his country residence, which is Holbeach House, and they have horses. They have some arms. They also have gunpowder on a wagon, and that gunpowder gets wet. So what they do, and this apparently is not unusual practice, although it sounds mad to a modern observer and things go badly wrong, they attempt to dry the gunpowder out in front of a fire, and the gunpowder catches alight and explodes, and several of the plotters are injured, and one at least is blinded.
Yeah, and so how do they actually get found? So who comes after them, and who has the last stand with Catesby's men?
Yeah, well, what happens is the Sheriff of Worcestershire, who's a man called Richard Walsh, he, I mean, obviously by now news of the plot is breaking, and I assume that that meeting of Catholics, which they get together under the pretense of a hunting party, that gets noticed. So there are rumours flying around, and as the group of the plotters are going through with the cart of gunpowder, etc., this must have been noticed. So this would have been brought to the attention of the authorities. So about 200 county militiamen zone into Holbeach House. They know the plotters are there, and the plotters go out to meet them with swords. Catesby and the Wright brothers in particular have a reputation for being handy with swords, handy sword fighters. They go out, and the militia have got muskets, and they just shoot them down basically. The Wright brothers, Catesby, and I think Henry Percy received fatal injuries. A number of the other plotters have already left. They get picked up later, and a number of the people who are actually taken to the house. I mean, the man who owns the house in particular are captured, and the whole thing ends well for the authorities. I mean, the any possibility of a rising by Midlands Catholics is completely contained at this point.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the execution of Guy Fawkes happens on the 31st of January 1606. That must have been horrendous. I don't understand why people would ever want to go and watch it, but there you go. So what happens to the other conspirators that are obviously not at the final stand?
Well, as I've said, a number of them, one or two of them do leave Holbeach House before the shootout. They are picked up. One, Tresham, I think it was, actually dies in captivity of natural causes. He's being held in jail, and he dies. But 8 of them stand trial in, I think it's the 27th of January 1606. Trial presided over by Sir Edward Cook, who's the Attorney General, the leading sort of legal official in the country. Obviously, guilty verdicts are going to be found. There's no way out. Only one of them actually pleads not guilty. So 8 of them are tried. The 8 survivors. They're executed in 2 batches, 4 of them on the 30th of January, 4 of them on the 31st, with Fawkes, as you say correctly, in that second batch. They're executed through a process called hanging, drawing, and quartering, which is absolutely horrendous. Do you want me to sketch it in for you?
Yes, please.
Okay, right, yeah. This is the standard punishment for male traitors who aren't noblemen. If you're a nobleman, you get beheaded. Hanging, drawing, and quartering, you are hanged symbolically. You're not hanged to your dead, you just hang symbolically. You're then cut down. You are disemboweled and emasculated. Your genitals and your bowels are burnt in a brazier that's on the scaffold in front of you, and you're then beheaded. Your body is divided into 4 quarters, and those quarters are exhibited around, well, London in this case. And it is an absolutely awful way of dying. What happens to Fawkes, though, possibly because he's been weakened by torture, is that he is taken up in stage 1 of this process and he's hanged, but he manages to jump off the scaffold and break his neck. So he dies quite easily compared to the others. But as you can see from the picture there, you are actually drawn to the place of execution on a hurdle. So you've got the men who are going to be executed, the plotters, being drawn through the streets of London in that very sort of, it's meant to shame them before they actually get to the place of execution.
So when the news goes around England eventually of this plot, how does it affect people's mindset? And do they think, are they more worried about Catholics than they've ever been before, do you think?
I think they are, yes. I mean, one point I would make, though, which again is a very interesting one, is the government handling of what happens after the plot is really very, very laid back. James does not want a pogrom of his Catholic subjects. And also, again, you've got the foreign policy dimension. James is trying to keep Catholic powers in France and Spain in particular as sweet as possible. So in a speech to Parliament early in 1606, immediately after the Parliament reconvenes, James says quite clearly that it's a horrible thing. It shows how unpleasant Catholics can be. You've got to watch Catholics, but not all of his Catholic subjects are like this. So he separates, as it were, the bulk of the Catholic population out from the plotters. And also he is quite strong on there being no foreign involvement. And this is repeated as, again, one of the main ways of disseminating government propaganda in London is through what's called the St. Paul's Cross sermons. These are held in the churchyard of St. Paul's Cathedral. And I forget which bishop it was, I think possibly the Bishop of Rochester, delivers a sermon where he repeats this point that, okay, it's a terrible thing, and however, not all Catholics are like this. And interestingly, he says that extreme Protestants can be as dangerous as Catholics. So they're trying very hard not to let mob violence happen. I think that's a crucial thing. This message goes down to the counties, so county authorities are obviously trying to keep things as under control as possible. But what you have is obviously Catholics are now even more under suspicion than they have been before. I don't know if anybody's checked this out. I certainly haven't. Perhaps I should do. Is whether or not you've got the penal laws against Catholics being imposed a lot more seriously after the plot. I mean, every year you get loads of Catholics being brought in and fined. Whether this is taken more seriously, and what you do have, though, in the medium to long term, is 2 things. One, another act which you can add to these continental massacres and so on, which you can add to the Armada, which you can add to the papal attempts to get rid of Elizabeth, to declare Elizabeth a notary monarch. You now have more evidence of Catholic plotting against England. But the other thing you have, and again, this is something which sounds very distant to us, which is tremendously important for the next 2 centuries, really, is further evidence of God saving the English, because the discovery of the plot is obviously, government vigilance, we would say. In the contemporary mindset, contemporary Protestant mindset, it's seen as being a sign of God's dispensation towards the English. It's a providence of God. God is showing that he wants England to succeed as a Protestant nation. And this is the way it's packaged in the years that follow.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that in the future this will have any bearing on the Civil War?
Yeah, it's a difficult one to plot.
I know it's a bit of both, obviously I know it's not all religious, but there is that religious undertone there, isn't there?
Well, there's more than an undertone.
Yeah,
but when the English Civil War is beginning, all of those old fears of Catholicism rise again, and certainly there is a fear, which is, as you'll know if you've studied it, something which was very much kicked off by the Irish Rebellion in 1641, which is the Catholic rising in Ireland against English Protestant rule. A fear of a Catholic rising in England. So it is something which is, I think, feeding into this general fear of Catholicism, which really takes off in 1641, 1642. And certainly, again, something which I would throw in, which is not widely known, I would argue that one of the main things that keeps November the 5th going in the public consciousness and popular consciousness is that in 1606, when Parliament reconvenes, legislation is passed enacting that in every English parish church on the 5th of November, there'll be a sermon celebrating God's deliverance of the English and God's discovery of the Gunpowder Plot. Now, these sermons, and lots survive in print, they're a perfect vehicle for keeping anti-Catholic sentiment going. And we know that in 1640, 1641, and 1642 at least, November 5th sermons are preached to Parliament, which again are warning about the Catholic plot. So it's hard to make a direct sort of connection, but obviously the concerns about Catholicism that are bubbling up in the early 1640s are being fed by the memories of November the 5th.
Yeah. And like you said, the Irish Rebellion is really sort of what starts off the Civil War in a way, isn't it? And this is, people have got to remember, it's the British Civil Wars, really. It's not just England, it's the whole island, British Isles. But anyway, so where does the tradition of bonfire and fireworks night come from? Obviously, you have sort of answered that. That is something new that I have just learned tonight, so I thank you for that, saying about the sermon. So is that where it starts, and how do we get to where we celebrate it today,
Well, that is an extremely long story. So,
yeah.
but very briefly, when the use of the plot breaks on the 5th of November 1605, people in London, where obviously the news gets around first, do spontaneously light bonfires. They come out and celebrate, and on this, distancing from foreign involvement, the French and the Spanish ambassadors are handing out drink to the London population. They're sort of helping them celebrate it. Now, I mentioned the sermon. What seems to happen very quickly is that local, it's best documented in towns. I think Canterbury, for example, have civic celebrations on November the 5th, as well as the sermons. We're going back to this idea that it is God's deliverance. It's something to celebrate. So you'll have public celebrations, popular celebrations, drink being distributed to the population. Fireworks certainly come in by the mid-17th century. I don't know how far back you can trace them. And we know from even sort of small country parishes where we've got churchwardens' accounts, churchwardens' financial accounts, that they will, provide money for firewood and for drink on the 5th of November. So this seems to come in at a very early stage. And then there is a long history where over the 17th century, it stays political. I mean, you mentioned the run into the English or British Civil Wars. in the 1670s, there are a series of crises about Catholicism, particularly related to the fact that Charles II has no legitimate heirs. So all is going to pass to his brother James, future James II, who is a Catholic. November 5th celebrations do get very political in the 1670s and continue to do so. James, of course, is replaced by William III in 1688, William and Mary. William lands by happenstance in England on the 5th of November, 1688. So it's that date again that comes in. Guy Fawkes' night as we know it really seems to come in the 19th century. Now, in the 18th century, the whole thing seems to go not exactly underground, but it's very badly documented. So obviously November the 5th celebrations are going on, the sermons are still being preached. But what happens in the early 19th century, there's a lot in the 19th century, I don't know how much you want to know, but it's in the 19th century that the communal bonfire, in the sense that we still know it today, starts. And also, it's early in the 19th century that Guy Fawkes is seen as the central figure. He's not really seen as a central figure in the 17th century. They'll be burning effigies of the Pope in the late 17th century. I haven't seen a lot about other effigies they're burning, but the penny for the guy stuff that you might remember as a child.
Yeah, I do remember that. I don't think that goes on anymore.
No, it doesn't. Yes, yeah. It's a less innocent age these days. You wouldn't let your kids out, would you? But
no.
That starts to be picking up around about 1840. So kids with a pram with a effigy of Guy Fawkes in it, that starts then. And I think there's stuff to be researched and written about how the Guy Fawkes, it seems to be that there's a big change over the 18th century that we just haven't found out about yet.
Yeah, and that's like you said. I mean, nowadays, it's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this video is I feel like the actual meaning of it has been forgotten. And again, I'm only going back to the 90s, and we used to sit there with a guy, at the shops getting penny and then go and have a bonfire, but I understood because we were taught it in schools, but I don't think it's taught anymore, this part of history. And it is a very important part of Britain's history, probably one of the most important parts, that's why I wanted to highlight it,
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
But it's very, very interesting, I honestly, I didn't know about the sermons. That's really interesting. Okay, so you have written a book on the subject. So you have you've got a UK version and one that was sold, which sells in America. So tell us about your book and how this opportunity came about.
Yeah, I suppose the basic concern is, obviously there is a brief account of the plot in the book, but the basic thing that was interesting me, further to just what we've just been talking about, is why is it 400 years after the event, it was published in 2005, why is it 400 years after the event we still remember what is essentially a failed act of terrorism? And I started off with that, and going back to what you were saying about people not really understanding what it was about, there's an incident I mentioned in the book, which was, goes back to the mid 1970s when I was, walking to work one morning in York, and there was a girl about 10 with a pram with Guy Fawkes in it, asking for pennies for the guy, and I said jokingly, I'm not going to give you anything because I was baptized Catholic, which I was. And she said, "What's that got to do with it?"
Oh,
and I just yeah. And so, as I said, that wasn't a formative incident or anything, but it's just something that came to mind. But I just thought it would be interesting to just try to find out how commemorating or celebrating, celebrating the sort of discovery of the plot, the quashing of the plot, how that changed over the centuries. And what I discovered, it's a short book, but what I discovered actually is the story is a lot more complex than you might think. But
Yeah.
you've got that long uh, journey from the sermon and the big civic celebrations in the early 17th century to your experience of collecting money when you were a kid and having a bonfire afterwards.
Yeah.
It's a long journey.
And yeah, it's always been a great memory for me, actually, firework night, as far as when I was younger, actually. Again, I know it is still, they do have the fireworks displays, but again, also I think at the time I don't ever remember it being about religious reasons either, actually. So
No.
yeah, it was just we remember it for being Guy Fawkes, and that's probably about it. Of course, when you get older, you realise that there's a lot more to it than you actually realise.
Yeah. Well, as with so much history.
Yeah. Anyway, James, sorry. Thank you for joining me. It's been fascinating to talk to you. Really enjoyed it. And I hope people get something from this podcast video and learn a bit about the Gunpowder Plot. So thank you for joining me.
Well, thanks for asking me. I enjoyed it.